Okay. I guess not a lot of people are coming today, and hopefully this Zoom thing will keep working. All right. Um, so why so many fewer than Tuesday? Okay. Um, so there's three things I want to talk about today. This is the last lecture on Locke, so hopefully I'll get to all of them, at least a little bit. Um, and this, so the first one is what Locke calls judgment. Um, the second one is like methods for extending our knowledge. So, like, I mean, basically, um, we've already talked about these, but um, we've already talked about these two: extending your knowledge by reason and extending your knowledge by instruction. Right? That is someone telling you something. um, uh, but I also want to talk about faith. This is the part of the book where Locke discusses the relationship between reason and faith. So this is the main thing here. And then number three, knowledge of existence. And the important thing to talk about here is Locke's proof of the existence of God. Um, because I think I've already said something about, well, I haven't said that much about knowledge of our own existence. Maybe if there's time, I'll say something about that. Like how his proof is related to Descartes or whatever. Um, but but this is the proof he keeps saying that he has, and now we actually get it. um, so it's worth trying to understand how it's supposed to work. Um, okay, so the first one, um, so first of all, I just need to emphasize one more time that Locke's standard for knowledge is really high, right? So he won't call something knowledge. So, I mean, so knowledge consists of propositions, and propositions consist of connection between ideas, right? Like ideas seen as either agreeing or disagreeing with each other. And knowledge is when you perceive that ideas agree or disagree with each other. Uh, and perceiving here means something that can't go wrong, right? So knowledge means like you're you're certain in the sense that you can tell that it couldn't be wrong, that these ideas agree or disagree. Right? So like it's not certainty as a very high degree of belief. Um, Locke actually says this isn't in the reading, but he talks about people who say that they know they have a message from God because it comes to them with so much like strength that they have to believe this, something like that. And Locke says that's no way of deciding what's true. Just because you believe it really strongly doesn't mean it's true. So knowledge is supposed to be not like a really high degree of belief or something like that. It's supposed to be seeing for yourself that the thing is true. um, um, Now, in addition to our faculty of knowledge, I mean, yeah, I guess you could call it the faculty of knowledge. In addition to that, we have a faculty of judgment. And the faculty of judgment is our ability to um, assent to or dissent from propositions, even though we don't perceive the agreement or disagreement of the ideas, either immediately or mediately, right? So there's two ideas like gold and fixed. And um, we assent to the proposition that these ideas are connected, that they agree in a certain way. In particular, in this case, it's the third start of agreement, right? It means we we think that the subject that's yellow and whatever else goes in the definition of gold, that fixed also belongs to that subject because of its its own real essence, its own internal nature. But we don't perceive that these ideas agree with each other, right? Like just by examining the ideas, we can't see that they agree with each other, and we don't have intermediate ideas that we can put in between, where every step is intuitive that way, and so we don't have a demonstration that they agree with each other. But we think they agree with each other, right? Like we have we have an opinion that they agree with each other. And it's not just an irrational opinion, right? It's not association of ideas. It's not just that we associate gold with being fixed. I mean, again, like exactly what the difference is here is, I don't know that Locke explains sufficiently well, and Hume is going to basically deny that there's a difference here. but it's not just that we associate these ideas with each other. We have arguments, we have proofs. They're not demonstrative proofs, right? They're not proofs that show beyond a doubt that that ideas agree with each other, but they're proofs that, make it probable that they agree with each other. And again, probable means provable, right? So it's like having proofs is what makes something probable. Um, so that ability that we have to um, assent to this proposition, perhaps assent to it quite strongly, even though we don't have a demonstrative proof that it's true, that's what Locke calls the faculty of judgment. It's, I mean, it's similar to what Descartes calls judgment, at least the faculty of judgment in Descartes. It's not what Kant means by judgment. I don't know if Locke gets it from Descartes. It's possible also Aristotle uses the term judgment, or at least crine, which means to judge in the De Anima, and maybe Locke is getting it from there. Um, but anyway, so for him, judgment means the ability to assent to a proposition without being, so to speak, forced to assent to it. At least, or well, it's complicated. I mean, because he thinks that probable arguments sometimes can be strong enough that we are forced to assent, right? Like if everyone agrees that this is true, and we've always experienced it to be true, then Locke says, we really can't help but assent to it. Um, and moreover, and that's rational, but also it's like it's not optional. um, uh, and we act on it as if we knew it was true, but it's still not knowledge. Um, yeah, I could read the definition. I basically just said it, but Um, Book 4, Chapter 14, Section 3, page 576. Um, the faculty which God has given man to supply the want of clear and certain knowledge in cases where that cannot be had is judgment, whereby the mind takes its ideas to agree or disagree, or which is the same, any proposition to be true or false, without perceiving a demonstrative evidence in the proofs. So, I mean, basically, this is what traditionally is called opinion. I mean, Locke also uses the word opinion. I think he thinks judgment is the name of the faculty, and opinion is one of the names for like the propositions we assent to this way. Um, um, so like the distinction he's making here between knowledge and um, judgment, no matter how rational, no matter how strong, is related to Plato's distinction between knowledge and true belief, right? Like when you know something, it's tied down by arguments. That's what Socrates says in the Meno. If you all you have is opinion, um, it it may be true and it may be useful, but since you don't have it tied down, you can't like rely on it, so to speak. Um, so um, uh, I mean, Locke has to have a somewhat better opinion of it than that because he's clear that we need this for to do anything, right? I mean, he says if you were to stop and not do anything unless you had knowledge that that was the right thing to do, you would starve to death, right? Like because you don't know that your food will nurture you and not poison you. You only, right? That's only an opinion, or it's only judgment. Like it's very strong. You have a very strong assurance, but you have no demonstration of it. So, right, so this is actually really important. However, as I've said before, not Locke seems to be much more interested in knowledge, right? He has much more to say about knowledge, and um, and when it gets to the question of how, like, there's supposed to be an order of reason in probable reasoning as well as in demonstrative reasoning, right? He emphasizes that over and over, but it's not exactly clear what the order is in probable reasoning. I mean, he talks about the kind of arguments that weigh for and against something, right? And in a case like this, so in the case of knowledge, you're not weighing different arguments against each other, right? Like if you actually perceive that the ideas agree, there can't be an argument that they don't agree. If you think that both of those things are happening, you made a mistake somewhere. Locke would probably say you made a mistake in words, right? Like you're probably using the same word two different ways or something, and that's confusing you. But anyway, but in this case where the proofs only establish probability, there can be arguments for and arguments against, and you might have to balance them off against each other. Like, for example, someone tells you something that um, is strange and you've never experienced it, but that person is a very credible person and they don't seem to have any motive for lying to you. And then you have to balance those two reasons against each other, right? Like he tells this story about the king of Thailand, I think, and a Dutch traveler tells or Dutch ambassador, or anyways, tells him that in his home country, water sometimes gets so hard that people can walk on it. And the king says, "Oh, come on. I believed all the other things you told me, but that's ridiculous." So, I mean, and like, I don't know. It's not clear from the way Locke tells the story whether the king was I think maybe the king was being rational in that case, even though he was wrong, right? Like, it's so strange that even though this very credible person is telling you, uh, you still shouldn't believe in it. I mean, that story also seems, so like if someone tells you that someone walked on non-frozen water, should you believe that? Right? Like that question seems to be in the background. Because I mean, Locke is definitely thinking about, um, I mean, it's going to turn out when we discuss faith that what faith delivers is always probability, not knowledge. So the question of whether you should believe in miracles is again, is a question of probabilities. And we're not going to read this, but Hume wrote a famous essay on miracles where he argues that um, although there's no reason to think a miracle is impossible, uh, you could never be right to believe it on someone else's testimony, right? Like it'll always be more probable that they're lying or mistaken, or whatever. Uh, so Locke presumably doesn't think that, but by using that example, he's bringing that question to the fore, I think. Um, okay, so I think that's all I want to say about that. Other questions about judgment? No, okay. Well, I'm going to go on to talk about extension of knowledge. Uh, so far, the Zoom thing is working. And I did press record, right? Yes. Okay. um, I don't want to erase these flowers. You know, no, I'll just leave them there. Uh, they were there when I came in, so. Um, okay, right. So how can we improve our knowledge? I mean, so first of all, obviously we can improve our knowledge by reason. Now, I mean, reason, as Locke says when he starts talking about reason, he says reason in English can mean a lot of different things, but he's using reason as a name for the faculty that tells us how to order ideas in order to get a proof. And it contains under itself also these two other faculties that he calls sagacity and elation. I, I think this is just arbitrary terminology on his part. Like I don't, but so by sagacity he means like the ability to find intermediate ideas. Because that's the hardest part of making a proof, right? You have these two things, like the two right angles and the interior angles of the triangle. And you have to find the intermediate idea or ideas. Um, and like once you find them, it's pretty easy to put them in the right order to get the proof, usually. So, but that's elation is the faculty of putting them in the right order to get the proof. And this word is waste time. No, okay. I'd love to talk about the etymology of this word, but it's not important. All right. So it's basically the same word as inference. Anyway, right. So therefore, one way of improving our knowledge, I mean, also a way of like adding to our rational opinion, but again, he's more interested in knowledge. So one way of improving our knowledge is by reason. Now, I think that actually, in a sense, is leaving something out. Like the first way of improving our knowledge is by intuition. You, like you might think that you can't improve your knowledge by intuition because intuition means you see immediately that the two ideas agree with each other. Um, but again, you have to bring the two ideas together and pay attention to each other. Pay attention to their relationship to each other. Before you do that, you don't know it, even if it's intuitively knowable. Right? That's Locke's point from way back when against innate principles. So, like, you know, it, that the arc of the circle is less than the whole circle is intuitively knowable, but the infant, before it's ever had the idea of a circle or the arc of a circle, can't know it. And even after it gets those ideas, it, like that proposition may never occur to it. So the first way we extend our knowledge is by intuition, actually. Uh, but this is the easy part. It's the hard part is extending our knowledge by reason, which means by finding proofs. Um, in his discussion of this, there's a couple of weird things about Locke's discussion of this. First of all, he seems to assume that we start off by knowing for sure what it is we want to prove. Right? Like the situation he's talking about is again the situation like this. I want to prove that these two are the same, and now I'm looking for the intermediate ideas to show that they're the same. Um, like he doesn't talk about the problem of like guessing what ideas are worth looking for intermediate ideas between. Which is presumably even harder than finding the intermediate ideas. Right? Like Euclid or whatever one of Euclid's predecessors first proved this. Um, I guess, how did they decide to try to prove it? One way would be by forming an opinion that it's true by trying it many times. And maybe in this case, that's what happened. Right? Like you measure the angles of many triangles and you find out they always add up to two right angles. And then you're like, wow, that can't be a coincidence. How can I prove that that's true? But other times it seems mathematicians somehow have a feeling that something is probably a theorem, right? It's like I called it conjecture. And it's not necessarily by testing lots of cases. So like I think to tell you the truth, I think we still don't understand how that works. So but anyway, Locke doesn't say anything about it. The other thing is that the other thing that's a little weird about Locke's like whole doctrine of proof is that he thinks, and he appears to think this is obvious, that the only thing a proof is good for is extending your knowledge. Right? So he says like a proof always starts with doubt. At the beginning of the proof, you have these two ideas, but you don't know whether they agree or disagree. I mean, you may have an opinion that they do of one degree or another. You at least guess that they do, but you don't know that they agree or disagree. And the reason for the proof is that after you finish the proof, now you'll know. So so that means that if you already know something, looking for a proof of it is a waste of time. So, I mean, this is weird, first of all, because mathematicians actually spend a lot of time looking for new proofs of things that have already been proved. um, uh, I mean, I think Locke had probably imagined some reason for doing like that, but it's going to be pretty weak. Maybe like if you can find a proof that's shorter and easier to remember, so you can teach it to people faster or something like that. Um, but I think like what he doesn't contemplate is the the possibility of looking for a proof is a way of trying to understand, well, number one, trying to understand why something is true, even if you're already, yeah, do you have a question? Wait, I sorry, I couldn't hear. Oh, well, I mean, radical doubt, like, I think that the point of, like, Descartes' point there is that he realized that he didn't know anything. Because, and I think Locke would agree at that point, right? Because, um, since all his opinions were all like mixed up with with falsehoods somewhere, um, he wasn't really sure why he believed any of them, and therefore, none of them amounted to knowledge. And the point of radical doubt was to like clear away all those opinions in order to look for knowledge. Um, um, and would Locke think that's a good idea? I mean, he doesn't seem to advocate it. I don't know a place that, well, so actually, I think, part of the point in his discussion of whether believing probable propositions is optional, I think part of it is actually an answer to Descartes, I guess. Sometimes he says, he's gonna discuss in what cases we're able to suspend judgment. So he probably thinks that the radical doubt maybe would be a good idea, but we can't do it. Um, um, yeah. So, but I mean, looking for a proof of something that you already know with certainty doesn't involve doubt. Um, uh, but there might still be something you want to know. I mean, I think if you ask mathematicians why they're interested in proofs, if they've thought about it, I think that, I think like it's not so much because they want to know whether the conclusion is true or not. Like they're in suspense. It's because they want to understand the relationship between different things, right? Like what depends on what. So if you can prove this from these axioms, then yeah, you've learned something about how much you need to get this conclusion or something like that, right? So a lot of contemporary mathematics is about that. I don't know how true that is of ancient mathematics, whether whether you can see that they're interested in things like that or not. Um, um, but I mean, this is also, I think, it's part of the same thing that Locke, number one, doesn't think axioms are good for very much, and number two thinks analytic propositions are trifling. So he thinks axioms aren't good for very much because, you know, like every step in this, if you ask about a particular two right angles in a particular triangle, you can find particular intermediate ideas, and every step in the proof will be like is intuitive, and none of them will appeal to any general axioms. Right. So, and then if you want a general proof, all you have to do is abstract a bit. And then you'll have a general proof. And again, like every step in the proof will be self-evident, but there's no need to appeal to general axioms. So like, for example, if at some point in the proof, you say, well, and so this is an arc of this circle, and therefore it's less than the whole circle. that's completely self-evident and intuitive. The axiom, the whole is greater than its parts, can't make it any more certain. So if the goal of proofs is to advance knowledge, the axiom isn't really helping that much. If the goal of proofs is to like organize knowledge, right? Like to show what depends on what, going back as far as you can, then the axiom may be important, even though it's not helping you learn the truth of the conclusion. So I think that's, I mean, um, um, and I, I think that's this is, I don't know whether they call this a blind spot in Locke, or say Locke has a very particular conception of proof and what it's for, and but a lot of the things we call proofs are just not really exercises in what he's talking about. So I mean, I think something similar can be said about, so he's not very, I think I didn't assign much, if I think I assigned maybe a little bit of this, but he has a long discussion of syllogisms and how useful syllogisms are, right? So syllogisms are the central part of formal Aristotelian logic, right? I mean, they're, you know, things like this. A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. So Locke says, like, take some clear argument and put it all in the form of syllogisms like this, and all of a sudden it becomes hard to follow. Right? So he says these syllogisms don't help make our arguments more convincing. They don't help us make proofs. He says, you know, at best, maybe if like your opponent recognizes the form of the syllogism, you can force them to concede. Although he says no one's ever been convinced by a syllogism. So, and he says, if you want to write this out formally, just write this, right? B connects A to C. All of this other stuff is just needless repetition and whatever. But, you know, I think, I mean, it's a question you can ask about our formal or mathematical logic also. Like, does it help us make better arguments? Can you convince someone better by putting your argument in the form of, you know, with quantifiers and all that stuff? And I think the answer is usually no. But the question, but I feel like that's actually not what either this stuff or that stuff is good for. If it's good for anything, it's for like understanding how arguments work, right? Like I think that's what Aristotle is using it for. It's not so much that he wants to make some really convincing arguments, because as many people have pointed out, when you read Aristotle, he argues for all kinds of things, but he essentially never puts it in this form. He just argues the way a normal person argues in words, right? But I think what Aristotle is doing with this is like trying to classify arguments and understanding what makes good arguments different from bad arguments. And again, like Locke doesn't seem to see the interest in that here. Okay. I think I already said some things about Locke's view on proofs before, and I gave that example. I don't know if I did rush through that example a little bit. Was the example proof pretty clear, at least the people who are here? Okay. I mean, almost needless to say, it's really unclear that, and then, I mean, this is one of the things that led people to reject Aristotelian logic eventually, long after Locke. Right? But like, it's really unclear, first of all, that everything that can be true or false has a form like this, two terms connected by a copula. Um, um, or that, yeah, it's hard to know what the right way to put this is. Because, I mean, like this is a famous example. Should I spend time on this? Right, the famous example, every horse has a head. So, I mean, it kind of looks like it's in this form. Um, but what this form doesn't, there's information that this form doesn't make clear that's contained in this. Like that there's a one-to-one correspondence between horses and heads. Um, I should have either not talked about this or prepared to talk about it, right? Not the third alternative. I'm talking about it without being prepared. Now I'm like, what's the famous, this is a famous example of an inference you can make from this, but it can't be put in syllogistic form. I don't know. All right, I won't go any farther with this then. But so the point is, and number two, it's really unclear that every valid inference looks like this. Or one of a few other forms that Aristotelians talk about. Um, um, but in this context, actually, well, is that important or isn't it? I mean, it's certainly like if that's true, then it's not really true that you can look at every proof as finding a bunch of intermediate ideas between two ideas. Right? Like the argument may be more complicated. And I think even if you go to some relatively simple arguments in Locke, but arguments that are important to him, such as, for example, his proof of the existence of God, it's like hard to put all the arguments into a form like this. Um, so, uh, but on the other hand, I feel like maybe that's not so important, that maybe it just means that this picture has to be made a little more complicated. Or maybe it means that some of the things we think of as, like I said, it's a problem for Locke's own arguments, which he claims yield knowledge. So I guess, I mean, no matter how you look at it, it is a problem for Locke if there's no way to represent the argument like that. Uh, but uh, but it, like I said, it could perhaps just be made a little more complicated and it would work. I don't know. Um, all right. Um, so remember, I wrote down three ways of extending your knowledge. Reason was the first one. So that's what I've been talking about. And the second one is instruction. But instruction, and we already saw this last time, instruction um, basically is the same thing as reason. So, right, so here's book 4, chapter 8, section 3 on page 540. He that would enlarge his own or another's mind to truths he does not yet know must find out intermediate ideas, and then lay them in such order one by another that the understanding may see the agreement or disagreement of those in questions. Right? So it's like, it's the same if you want to learn the truth yourself or if you want to teach to someone else, you have to lay out the ideas in the correct order. And then, as I said last time, obviously, in order to transmit them to the other person, you have to lay out your words in the right order. Um, um, but uh, um, that's the only difference, right? So learning something by your own reason, it may be much harder than having someone tell you. But it's, what makes it harder is that if you figure it out yourself, you have to find the intermediate ideas and put them in the right order. Whereas if someone tells you, they already know the intermediate ideas and they put you in the right order for you. But if they actually manage to teach you, because like if they say the proof one step after another, but you don't follow it, then they haven't taught you. I mean, you may have gained a strong opinion because you're like, oh, wow, that mathematician's pretty smart. If they think this proof is good, it's probably good. So the conclusion is probably true, right? So, then you would have a strong opinion that it's true, but you don't know it's true unless you yourself go through the steps of the proof as they lay them out for you. So it's the same thing you would do without them. They're just like helping you along from one step to the next. Um, um, as opposed to in the case of opinion. And this is kind of the segue to the faith case, right? Because in the case of opinion, someone telling you that something's true is its own kind of reason for believing it. And it's not the same as what you would do if you tried to find out for yourself. Right? So, like if I say, wow, traffic on 880 was really bad today, I don't know why. And assuming none of you were driving on 880 just now, unlike me, unfortunately. And right, so you've just found out that traffic was bad on 880 without having to drive on 880 yourself. So I haven't like brought you along somehow through my experience. um, so, um, um, and in many cases, as in that case, that's an advantage, right? Like this is it's a good way of learning things without having to have certain experiences yourself. Of course, it's like how good an argument it is, that is how probable it makes the proposition, is going to depend on how much you believe me. Both like how much you believe I'm being truthful and how much you believe um, I'm not mistaken. Um, so there would be one case where uh, where this kind of reason could yield knowledge. If God told me, right? So if God told me that traffic was bad on 880 today, then I know God is not a deceiver, right? So Locke agrees with Descartes about that. And God can't be mistaken. So I have, so to speak, a demonstration that it's true, even though it doesn't go by way of the type of intermediate ideas you might expect. Right, so again, like, traffic was bad on 880 today. How do you write that? That might be a better example of something that's hard to write in this form. Right, like where do you put in the today, or that all has to be part of the predicate. Yes, so that like the subject is 880 and the predicate is bad traffic today. And these are particulars. Well, is that important? Actually, maybe for Locke, that's not important. But what is important is that there's no necessary connection between these two ideas, right? Like, examine the ideas as much as you want. You won't find anything like a geometrical proof. But now if God tells me that it's true, then, and again, it's not really clear whether this intermediate idea intermediates in the same way, right? But we have somehow here, we have the intermediate idea of like, God says so. And that's what allows me to connect the two ideas. Okay, so faith. So I think so Locke, when he talks about faith here, is mostly or really fully focused on religious faith. But I think he's using faith. He's taking the religious term faith to be like not a special use of the word faith, but to be the same as having faith in another person. Right? It's just the usual question of trusting someone. So this is the definition of faith. It's on page 608, book 4, chapter 18, section 2. Section 2. Oh yeah, it's lower down in section 2. All right. Faith, on the other side, is the assent to any proposition, not thus made out by the deductions of reason, but upon the credit of the proposer as coming from God in some extraordinary way of communication. This way of discovering truths to men we call revelation. Right? So he's defining religious faith as believing someone who tells you that God told them that something is true. And he says that's what's called revelation. So like the picture is here's God. God somehow tells this person that something is true. Tells them in some supernatural way, right? Because it is like every time you use your reason to discover something is true, Locke says, in a sense, God is telling you it's true. Right? Like, I mean, he's not by no means the first person to say that. That's almost like standard in, well, I mean, going back to Socrates, probably in the philosophical tradition, to say something like that. Right, but no, but here it's not where the person doesn't tell you, I have a proof that it's true, and that's how God told them. Because if that's how God told them, then to instruct you, they should tell you the proof. But instead, they say, no, God told me in a supernatural way that this is true. So, like, this is the prophet, and then this is me, and they tell me that it's true. And it's on credit. Right, let me read that definition again. Upon the credit of the proposer, right? So credit is right, is related to the Latin verb credere, which means to believe, right? And credo means I believe, and that's what we're translating as having faith, right? Like it's credere is the Latin verb that we're translating when we talk about faith. It's, I guess, itself being used as a translation of Greek um, pistis, I guess the word for faith in Greek. But anyway, Latin's not, Locke's not thinking about Greek. He does know some Greek. Sometimes he uses a word or two in Greek, but he mostly thinks in Latin. He actually, he occasionally uses a word in Hebrew, and I know that he was required to take Arabic. I found this out, I forget, by reading some biography or something. Like in those days at Oxford, you had to learn not only Latin, but Greek and Hebrew and Arabic. But I've never seen any sign of him using the Arabic, so I guess he didn't learn very much. But anyway, mostly though he speaking in Latin, right? So when he says on the credit of, he's connecting it to faith, right? Faith is taking something on credit, that is taking it on faith. uh, so so Locke is, discussing this as uh, a different way of extending our knowledge. Um, but he keeps saying, and if you pay attention, it's clear that really the way of extending our knowledge here is still reason. Because again, this is just like any case. This is just like you believing me that traffic was bad on 880 today. I come in and say, traffic was bad on 880 today. You have to think, number one, how probable is that? Pretty probable. There's often bad traffic, right? And number two, do I have any reason for lying? Is there some reason to suspect me of, right? And like you add up all those factors and you say, okay, yeah. And, or, is it likely that I hallucinated that? That I really spent all day in Santa Cruz and I just, right? So like you add up all those factors and you decide whether to believe me or not. Well, so this situation, so at first Locke says this is called revelation, but then when he describes revelation in more detail, he calls this situation traditional revelation. Traditional revelation means the situation of someone like this. So it's not that God told me something. Someone told me that God told them something. That's the tradition, that is the like handing over. And the exact same factors are going to come into play, right? Like I'm going to say, um, is this person trustworthy? Is it possible for God to do this? Locke says yes. But does it happen very often? Maybe not. Are there other things that make people think it happened when it didn't really? Yes. Locke is pretty clear about that. Are there reasons people claim that it happened when they know very well it didn't? Again, yes. Right? So I'm going to have to scrutinize this person pretty carefully to decide whether to believe them. And all of that is reason, right? I mean, it's reason in cases of probability. And it's clear just from the picture that this can't amount to demonstrative knowledge. Right? It can't rise to the level of demonstrative knowledge. I'm never going to see a necessary connection between the two ideas that you say are connected. All I'm going to see is that, yeah, they're probably connected, assuming you're telling the truth, et cetera, et cetera. And like, if you're very trustworthy to me and like, maybe you also do miracles or, right. Like it could rise to the level that I have a very strong assent to it, but it's not going to get better than that. Um, so 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 faith in this sense is really just another way of using my reason. It certainly can't go against reason. Right? I mean, if I came into you and said, I was driving on 880 today and I saw a round square, uh, you know, you wouldn't stop to think how credible I am, et cetera, et cetera. You would say a round square is impossible. So what he's saying can't be true. Right? So, like, similarly, if this prophet says, God told me there's a round square, then this person is gonna, like, if you find a piece of knowledge that contradicts the proposed probable proposition, then that's like, that settles the argument right there. Right? So if the prophet says, God told me there's a round square, I'm going to say, well, I don't know what happened here. I mean, I say it certainly wasn't that God told you there's a round square, because God doesn't lie and can't be mistaken. But I don't know what did happen. Either God told you something and you misunderstood it, or God didn't tell you anything, but you thought he did, or you're lying, or whatever. But anyway, I know the alternative that can't be right is that there really is a round square, because I can see using my own reason that's impossible. Um, and remember that Locke thinks that morality at least could be as demonstrative as geometry. Right? So if this prophet comes and tells me, God said to kill these innocent people and take all their stuff, which type of thing supposedly coming from God apparently appears in lots of religious works, right? God told me to kill these innocent people and take all their stuff. I'm going to think, well, I have a demonstration that God doesn't want me to kill all these innocent people and take all their stuff. And moreover, that he's going to punish me in the afterlife if I do. Right? So then you're going to say, back to the prophet, sorry, I don't believe you, because what you're saying is impossible. And I can see by my own reason that it's impossible. So that's pretty important to Locke. I mean, forgetting like what it says in the Old Testament or whatever, there was, there had recently been a civil war in England, which was partly a religious war. And people were running around saying stuff like, we're the saints, everyone's property belongs to us. So it's on the top of Locke's mind that we have to have a way of understanding faith and revelation that makes that impossible, right? Like they can't be right. I mean, and of course, this is especially obvious if you put in a lot of other people. I heard it from this person, they heard it from this person, they heard it from the prophets. Or, so like Locke talks about this case on page 610, chapter 18, section 4. Well, I guess maybe I should start reading on the previous page. Nobody, I think, will, all right. For example, the history of the deluge is conveyed to us by writings which had their original from revelation. And yet nobody, I think, will say he has as certain and clear a knowledge of the flood as Noah that saw it, or that he himself would have had he then been alive and seen it. For he has no greater an assurance than that of his senses that it is writ in the book supposed writ by Moses. supposed writ by Moses inspired. But he has not so great an assurance that Moses writ that book as if he had seen Moses write it. Right? So he's saying, like, there's two things here, right? If it was just me, and I guess now, like I said, Locke usually thinks about speech rather than writing when he thinks about language. But for obvious reasons, he has to talk about writing now when he talks about religious tradition. Right? So like now, instead of Moses talking to me, imagine like I hand Moses a pad of paper and a pen, and Moses writes on it, there was a big flood. God told me there was a big flood, and hands it to me. So Locke says, even if I'm this first person, my assurance that there was a flood cannot be as great as the sensible knowledge I would have if I actually saw the flood. So it's not knowledge, it's just opinion. But then he adds, and moreover, my knowledge that Moses wrote that book is not as good as it would be if I was the one who saw him write. Because what actually happened is that this guy, thousands of years ago, I mean, this is the story I've heard. The story I've heard is that this guy, thousands of years ago, saw Moses write the book. And then, like, hundreds of thousands of people copied the book. And then someone handed it to me and said, hey, Moses wrote this book. Right? So, obviously, my assurance is a lot less than it would be if I saw Moses write it himself. Now, Locke, I think, I mean, it's so hard to be sure about this. And also, Locke wrote a whole book about this, which I still have not read, called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And I don't know what he says there. But I mean, but you can tell from the title, it's not an anti-Christianity book, right? So it's, I mean, Locke, I think, doesn't want to follow this conclusion that Hume wants to follow it to. Right? So, I mean, since this revelation in this sense is an example of a miracle, however it works, right? Because that's the whole point. It's a supernatural way of knowing something. It's not the natural way of knowing with your reason, with your senses. So, I mean, I think this is going to fall under, anything like this is going to fall under Hume's conclusion that although if you experience a miracle yourself, you might believe that it happened. Like Hume concedes that. But he says, if you just hear about it from someone, so you're balancing, and Hume defines a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. So that is of the laws that we've gathered by induction about nature, right? So like Hume says, on the one hand, you have the probability that there was a violation of the laws of nature, which is pretty much the lowest probability you could get, right? Because the laws of nature are, like, almost by definition, the most probable results of all our experience, right? So, and on the other hand, you have the chance that someone in the grip of religious enthusiasm and or political machination has made a mistake or deliberately obscured the truth or whatever. And he says, that's not only not very improbable, that happens all the time. Right? Like that's a particularly probable thing. So he says, so obviously, whenever you're in this situation, you're going to choose the latter. I don't think Locke wants to follow it that far, but I'm not sure exactly how he wants to stop it from going that far. But then, on the other hand, if you go in the other direction and say, okay, what about the prophet themselves? can't they receive information from God that would go against their own reasoning? Um, um, but Locke says, and this is an exact same place I was reading before on page 610. Unless where God immediately reveals it to us, and there too our assurance can be no greater than our knowledge is that it is a revelation from God. Right? So like I blurred over the question of like what actually happens here. But now let's get into what happens. I hear a voice in my head. I see a burning bush that isn't consumed. Right? I don't know exactly what happens here, but um, at least the way Locke is thinking of it, since again, if God wanted me to teach me something that my reason could find out for itself, then God could take me through the proof, so to speak. And then it would be irrelevant whether God really said it or not. Right? Like if I hear a voice in my head proving that these angles add up to two right angles, and I check the proof and it's good, then I don't have to worry about whether the voice was God or a hallucination or the devil or whatever. I have the proof, right? But this is, so Locke thinks that like this has to be a case where God somehow does what's equivalent to a human telling me something. And so there's some kind of like, there's something I sense internally or externally that's good, that is God's revelation. And then the question is going to be, can I be so sure that that really came from God? If I was sure it came from God, I could be sure it was true because God doesn't make mistakes and God doesn't lie. But if what it said is there's a round square, then I'm going to say, well, that could be a voice coming from God because God wouldn't say something false and the round square is impossible. Right? So even in the case of original revelation, and again, this applies to morality, according to Locke, at least if morality were on the basis it should be, right? I mean, Locke says we don't actually have a geometric like system of morality, but we could and we should. If we paid more attention and did it better, we would. So, and I guess he thinks we have at least some pieces of it. So yeah, so even the prophet can't receive a revelation that goes against their own reason. So what kind of revelation, what kind of cases would revelation be useful? Locke says, well, like for example, to tell us things that we couldn't find out for ourselves because we don't have the senses, or because they're too far in the future or the past or whatever, right? So like particulars like that, like there was a huge flood, right? If we can't figure that out from our own records or whatever, then that would be useful. Or like the angels in heaven rebelled and some of them were cast out, or whatever. That's one of Locke's examples. It says we have no senses that will allow us to perceive angels, and we can only find out, and it happened before we were created, and right, like we can only find out those things like that by revelation. Again, it's a little unclear. Locke, not just in one place, but often will mention that in addition to morality that can be derived by reason, there could be other things that God told us to do by revelation. Now, you can see from this that they couldn't go against morality, right? They would have to be otherwise indifferent things. Something like don't eat pork, right? So like, let's say forgetting about whether it's moral to eat animals or whatever, right? So assume you're not worried about that. So you'd say, well, okay, there's, as far as I can tell from our reason, there's no reason to eat it or not to eat it. Um, so it's indifferent, and so that's something where God could tell us to do it. But I guess the question would be, why would God tell us to do it? So, um, I guess that, like, I guess I shouldn't speculate too much about what, because first of all, although Locke always mentions this possibility, we don't recall him ever giving an example of it. And after all, he's not Jewish or Muslim or even Catholic, right? So his religion doesn't involve a lot of weird rituals. In fact, part of what he says about why it's so important to use our reason here and whatever is because otherwise people who have these weird rituals can like claim they came from God and we won't be able to mock them. Right. So, right. So, I mean, I, I think that if Locke would have to think that if there is something like this, that um, it's really advice rather than a law, right? That is, it's really something that God knows will be best, will have public utility, but we're not able to figure that out. So he would like help us by telling us or something like. I'm not sure if that will fit every text that Locke says. Um, um, I mean, it's certain that Locke thinks, and he does say this explicitly, like, if I do my best to figure out whether this is a genuine revelation or not, and I use my reason the way I'm supposed to, and I conclude that it's not, but as a matter of fact, it actually was, so I'm wrong, right? Locke says, well, obviously you can't be punished for that. You did exactly what you were supposed to. um, um, yeah, now, and of course, one place this is heading, as usual, this is back in the same um, book 4, chapter 18, section 5 on page 610. Um, For since no evidence of our faculties by which we receive such revelations can exceed, if equal, I can't equal actually, right? So can exceed, if equal, the certainty of our intuitive knowledge, we can never receive for a truth anything that is directly contrary to our clear and distinct knowledge. For example, the ideas of one body in one place do so clearly agree, and the mind has so evident a perception of their agreement, that we can never assent to the proposition that affirms the same body to be in two distant places at once, however it should pretend to the authority of divine revelation. Right? So again, like he's getting in his attack at transubstantiation, right? Saying that, this isn't up for debate. Someone can't tell me, according to what God told me or the way God guided the Pope or whatever, you should believe in transubstantiation. Because Locke says transubstantiation involves, among other things, the same body being in two places at the same time. And we can see intuitively that that's not possible. Um, um, and again, I guess the question is with Locke exactly how far. So, I mean, with Hume, and I think we'll see some examples of this in Hume. Um, where so Hume likes to use the word superstition and use examples that will make a lot of his readers think that he's talking about Catholicism. Whereas actually Hume thinks that all religions are superstition. Right? So it's like a trick, you know. Uh, but um, that's again probably not the case with Locke. Um, um, but what his exact relationship is to that, like 39 articles of the Church of England or whatever, I'm not sure. Um, okay. As usual, I put off the knowledge of existence until there's not enough time to do it justice. But are there questions about this before I go on about like reason, faith, revelation, any other minor matters like that? What's that? Are they trifling? I mean, trifling propositions, according to Locke, are no good for reasoning, right? Because they connect the same idea back to itself. So they don't get you anywhere that you weren't already. Um, but I mean, like leaving aside the issue of history of terminology and whatever, like, like imagine reading this book into translation into contemporary philosophical English, like how much you'd be missing. Like, I bet they don't translate trifling as trifling. And I'm sure they don't say the book that Moses writ. Or like and units. All right. It's worth a few misunderstandings. All right, but anyway, so now knowledge of existence. I mean, so again, just briefly, because since there's not much time, I'm going to focus on the most interesting one. But right, there's three cases where Locke says we have this fourth kind of knowledge of existence. Um, right, the first is my own existence. Is this really my pen or is this one of their pens? Because it's not working. Locke says this is intuitive. Then there's existence of God. All right, existence of God, and then there's so I mean, there's something interesting to say about all of these, all three of these. Um, uh, what are the two ideas here that are intuitively connected? How is it related to Descartes' argument? Locke actually mentions at some point, gives something that's kind of like a paraphrase of Descartes' argument in the second meditation, where he says, even if I should try to doubt it, my very doubt will prove blah, blah, blah. But it probably doesn't mean exactly the same thing as it does in Locke. This is really interesting, but I've already said, although I don't know if anything I said about it was clear, but I already said a bunch of things about this, about like exactly what it means and how it's supposed to work, that I have a knowledge of the existence of things that I'm sensing right now, although I might be wrong about what they are. But I know there's something white there because it's causing the idea of white in me right now. And also of things that I remember. Although I might be wrong about what when they happened, or what things happened together. I think you have to add in, right? But if I have the idea of white at all, I must have got it sometime. So that memory also gives me a certain knowledge of external existence. Um, but, and then another question is, so why is this less certain? As Locke keeps saying that this is rises to the level of certainty and may be called knowledge, but it's not as certain as this, which, like, I don't even know what that means. But um, and when he argues against skepticism, well, so let me just take over. I won't say any more about it, much as I want to. I'm going to talk about Locke's proof of the existence of God. I mean, I guess that's the right decision. I'm not even sure. So, so this is supposed to be demonstrative. Um, and the conclusion of the proof is, this is always really important when you see a philosophical proof of the existence of God. And I think, I mean, Berkeley sort of has a proof of the existence of God, but it's so short that it's hard to talk about. And Hume, of course, does not have a proof of the existence of God because presumably is an atheist. But when you, so this may be the only one we're really talking about this quarter, but like whenever you see a philosophical proof of the existence of God, you have to first ask, okay, what are they trying to prove? Like, what's the conclusion? So the conclusion here is, this is book 4, chapter 10, section 6. There is an eternal, most powerful, and most knowing being. And to which Locke immediately adds, which whether anyone will please to call God, it matters not. Right? And he could also add, if they, and I mean, he does in effect add in other places, if they please to call something else God, that's not what I'm talking about. Right? So if it means like a big man with a long white beard who sits up in a cloud and throws thunderbolts or whatever, right? That's, Locke can't prove the existence of that. But an eternal, most powerful, and most knowing being. I think at that one place he's stating it pretty carefully in the sense that, I mean, so he'll say omnipotent and omniscient, that is like all powerful and all knowing. But remember what we want this proof for. So that's another thing you always have to ask when you see a philosophical proof of the existence of God. Why are they trying to prove that this thing exists? Right? We want the proof for is actually, so this is the beginning of book 4, chapter 10 on page 547. Nor can we justly complain of our ignorance in this great point, that is the existence of God, since he, that is God, has so plentifully provided us with the means to discover and know him, so far as is necessary to the end of our being and the great concernment of our happiness. Right? It's the reason it's important to know this is that knowing this is going to drastically change your calculations about how to get happy, how to get pleasure and avoid pain. And in particular is going to convince you to be moral. That is to like align your own will with the universal will. And for that, all you need to know is that if anyone else proposes rewards and punishments, God can outbid them. Right? And if anyone else is really sure to catch you if you violate their law, God is more accurate. Right? Like there's no chance of getting away with something. Or at least if you think there's there's little chance of getting away with diluting the state or your club. There's even less chance of getting away with, with diluting God, right? So that is, all you have to know is that God is most powerful and most knowing, which is basically the same as infinitely powerful and infinitely knowing if you plug back in Locke's definition of infinity, right? It just means like any finite amount I give you. And these things will have to be tied back to matters of quantity to make sense of the predicate infinite, right? But all right. So that's what we're looking for here and why we're looking for it. So the proof, in detail. Oh boy, I can't give the proof in detail because there's only 3 minutes left. So I'll give the proof in not detail. The proof starts with my own existence. I mean, it has to basically because that's the only case where I have an intuitive connection between some idea and existence. And the proof is going to have to somehow connect the idea of God to the idea of existence. So the only thing that's intuitively connected to existence is me. So the next idea has to be me. Then somehow we have to get from that to God. Now, I mean, the way we get from that to God is to argue that something can't come from nothing. That is, that pure nothingness can't produce any results. That's supposed to be intuitive. So that means that anything now exists either must have always existed or something must have existed before it that caused it to exist. Yeah, I think like Locke doesn't provide a strong argument how I know that I've never existed, at least not directly. But I mean, if you look at some of the other things he says, I think you can figure out how that would go. But I mean, that is, you have to prove first that I'm not God, just as Descartes has to prove in the third meditation. Like part of the proof is to prove that I'm not God. So since I'm not God, and then this is a version of what Kant calls the cosmological proof. I'm not God, meaning I'm so imperfect that I couldn't have caused myself to exist. In this case, the imperfection is that I haven't always existed. And so the kind of thing I'm gonna have to, and then as usual, you're gonna have to say, and there can't be an infinite regress. As usual, this is a little bit suspect. Maybe there could be an infinite regress, right? But Locke says there can't be an infinite regress. I mean, he doesn't even say this. He takes it so much for granted. There can't be an infinite regress. So you can say I was caused to exist by something that itself, using this line for the wrong thing, but I was caused to exist by something was itself caused to exist, et cetera, et cetera. But after a finite number of steps, you have to get back to something that always existed. And that's God. And then the only thing that's left is to prove that God is most powerful and most knowing, which he basically gets to by claiming that it's intuitive that knowledge, that a non-knowing being can't create a knowing being, and that the cause has to have every power that it gives the effects. Both of those again could be pretty questionable. I mean, you have to, and so you'd have to look into why. And if I were going to go through the proof in detail, I would discuss why Locke might think those things are true. But so like that's enough. Again, it's not clear exactly how to draw that as a series of connected ideas, but the proof is something that's knowing exists and has not always existed. Therefore, there must be something knowing that has always existed, and moreover, any power that anything else have must have come from that thing that's always existed. Therefore, that thing is most powerful and most knowing. the proof doesn't really show that God is good. This is a problem. Right? Like that is, we're still left with this question, how do we know that what God wants is public utility? I don't think Locke's proof as given here answers that, and I'm not sure, it can't be that that has not occurred to Locke, but I'm not sure what he would say about it. And okay, I'm sorry, I went 2 minutes over. So next week, Barkley. See you then.